A chair scraped back so fast it almost tipped over. That was the first thing Odessa Kamara noticed when she walked into the boardroom on the 43rd floor of Meridian Capital's Toronto headquarters. Not the floor-to-ceiling windows. Not the 7 suits already seated around the mahogany table. The chair and the man who shoved it back. Senior partner Clifford Stanhope, 62 years old, 28 years with the firm. A man whose name was on the building's donor wall 1 floor down. Looked at her the way people look at a package left at the wrong address. Associate entrance is on the lower level, he said. Not a question, not an apology, a direction. Odessa was 26. She had taken the elevator from the lobby like every other person on the guest list. She was wearing the same charcoal blazer she had worn to her convocation at Dalhousie Law 3 years ago, the one her mother had pressed the night before with a travel iron borrowed from the neighbor across the hall. Had a lanyard around her neck with her name on it because the firm had sent it to her hotel room the night before, along with a welcome packet that said, "We are so excited to have you join us for the National Arbitration Symposium." And she set the lanyard on the table so the text faced him. Read it. He didn't apologize. He picked up his phone instead. That is the thing about certain rooms. They don't make space for you. They make you announce yourself, and then they make you prove it wasn't a mistake. Odessa Kamara sat down in the chair closest to the window. She opened her folio, she uncapped her pen, and she waited. She had grown up in Halifax, in a house that always smelled like her mother's jollof rice and WD-40, because her father, Dr. Emmanuel Kamara, was a mechanical engineer who fixed things on weekends, the way other fathers watched football. He fixed things that didn't need fixing, and things that were so far gone, the parts had to be ordered from 3 provinces away. Her mother, Dr. Uncomfort Kamara, taught developmental psychology at Dalhousie and had opinions about everything, and was right about most of it. Had come from Sierra Leone before Odessa was born. They had arrived in Halifax in February, which her mother still described as an act of God's sense of humor. They had built their life with the particular stubbornness of people who had decided, very deliberately, that this was home. Odessa was their only child. She had read every book in the Halifax Public Library's young adult section by the time she was 12, which is when she started reading adult books, which is when she discovered that the world was more complicated and more interesting and more unfair than she had been led to believe. She decided she wanted to fix that. Her father had laughed and said she had his blood. Had gone into law because arbitration is where contracts go when they break, and somebody has to figure out who was right. She was good at figuring out who was right. She was better at explaining why, in language so precise that people who had been fighting for years sometimes sat back and said, "Oh, the way you say it," when a knot comes loose. Had published a paper at 24 on equitable damages in commercial arbitration that a professor at Osgood had assigned to his 3rd-year class without knowing how old she was. When he found out, he had sent her an email that said, "I don't know whether to be impressed or embarrassed." She had replied, "Both seems right." She had been invited to the National Arbitration Symposium because she had applied, and because her paper had been selected from 412 submissions, and because a review committee of 9 had ranked it first. None of that was in the room on the 43rd floor. What was in the room was senior partner Clifford Stanhope and partner Hugo Llewellyn, who hadn't looked up from his laptop since she sat down, and 5 other people whose names she was still learning, and a morning agenda that listed at 10:15 a practitioner discussion on novel frameworks in commercial dispute resolution. That was hers. That was why she was here. A symposium ran across 2 days. The first morning was keynotes. The afternoon was breakout panels. Odessa sat in the 3rd row because the front 2 were reserved, and the back of the room was already full when she arrived. A took notes in the margins of her printed agenda. The person beside her, a woman named Bridget Asante Odom, who was a junior partner at a firm in Ottawa, leaned over at one point and said quietly, "Your paper, right? One on equitable damages." Odessa nodded. Bridget said, "I used it in a brief last spring. It held up." That was the whole conversation. But Odessa thought about it for the rest of the morning. Afternoon panels were where things began to shift. She was not presenting until day 2, but she was on a panel that afternoon as a discussant, which meant she would respond to 2 other presentations before the floor opened for questions. The moderator was a retired judge named the Honorable Gordon Fetz, who had the particular quality of being completely unimpressed by everything in a way that made the room feel safe. He introduced each speaker without editorializing. He kept time, did not add his own opinions into other people's sentences. The first presenter was a senior partner from Vancouver who spent 22 minutes on a framework he had been developing for 8 years and which Odessa, who had read his earlier publications, thought had 3 significant gaps. She wrote them in her margin in small, neat letters. A second presenter was a professor from McGill who was sharp and funny and got to her point in 12 minutes, which left 8 minutes for the third member of the panel, who had not shown up, and which the moderator simply absorbed by expanding the discussion window. And it was Odessa's turn to respond. She stood up. Hugo Llewellyn, from the morning boardroom, was seated near the aisle, in the 5th row. He looked at her with the expression of a man calibrating whether this was going to be worth his time. Odessa had a page of notes. She didn't use them. Addressed the Vancouver presentation first. She said she found the framework genuinely valuable in its approach to tiered remedies, and then she said that she wanted to push on 3 assumptions embedded in the model, and she named them, and she explained why each one created downstream problems in cases involving non-standard contract structures. She was specific. She cited cases. She did not hedge. Vancouver partners started writing. And she turned to the McGill professor's presentation and said it was, in her view, the most practical contribution to the field she had encountered at a symposium in 3 years, and she meant it, and she said why. Someone in the back laughed a little, not unkindly. It was the kind of laugh that happens when something lands exactly right. She sat down. Honorable Gordon Fetz said, without inflection, "Thank you, Miss Kamara." And then he opened the floor for questions, and 4 of the first 5 questions were directed at her. That evening, there was a reception on the 41st floor. The kind with small plates and wine and people standing in loose clusters, talking about things they would never say in a meeting room. Odessa had a glass of sparkling water because she was presenting in the morning, and she wanted her mind clear. She stood near the window and looked out at Lake Ontario, which was doing what Lake Ontario does in October. Gray and large, and not particularly interested in being looked at. Senior partner, Clifford Stanhope, approached her at 7:43. Noticed, because she was watching the room in her peripheral vision the way she always did in spaces where she had not yet decided she was welcome. Said, "That was a strong response this afternoon." I said it the way a person says something that costs them something to say. Odessa looked at him. She said, "Thank you." There was a pause. He said, "The damages paper, that's yours?" And she said yes. I said, "Stanhope read it, my son. He's 2nd year at Osgood." He paused again. He said it changed how he thought about remedy theory. Odessa did not say anything for a moment. And she said, "Tell him I hope it holds up in practice." And Stanhope nodded once, slowly, and moved away. He did not apologize for the morning, but his face, she thought, was different from what it had been. Not ashamed, exactly. Something more useful than shame. Something that looked like recalibration. She turned back to the window. Bridget Asante Odom appeared beside her with a glass of red wine and said, "Was that Stanhope?" Odessa said yes. Bridget said, "What did he want?" Odessa thought about it. "I think," she said slowly, "he came to update his priors." Day 2 began with a light frost on the windows of her hotel room and a text from her mother that said, "Jollof is waiting when you get home. Show them who you are." Odessa stood in the elevator at 8:50 with her folio and her notes and the particular stillness that comes from knowing you have done the work. Not confidence exactly, something quieter, certainty. Morning session was the centerpiece of the symposium. The room held 230 people. It was a full house. She could see it as she stood at the back, waiting to be introduced, scanning the rows the way her father had taught her to read a room, not for threat, but for texture, for who was paying attention, for where the energy was. Honorable Gordon Fedditz introduced her from the podium without excess. He named her affiliation, her paper, the review committee's ranking. He said, "Ms. Kamara will be presenting a proposed framework for recalibrating equitable standards in multi-party commercial arbitration. You have 30 minutes, Ms. Kamara." And she walked to the front. There is a silence that happens in rooms just before someone speaks who the room has not yet decided about. It is not hostile, necessarily. It is waiting. It is the breath the room takes before it decides whether to lean in or lean back. Felt it. She had felt it before. She set her folio on the podium. She looked out at 230 people. She said, "There is a case most of you will know, Harrington Industrial v. Meridian Supply Group, 2019. The award was upheld on appeal, and 3 of you in this room cited it in publications last year. I cited it too, and I think we were all wrong to." The room stilled. She had their attention before the second sentence was finished. Next 28 minutes, Odessa Kamara dismantled a widely used precedent with the particular care of someone who respects the original work enough to tell the truth about where it fails. She did not showboat. She did not perform. Walked them through the structural problem in the 2019 reasoning, then through the 4 subsequent cases it had distorted, then through what she believed was a more defensible framework, and she showed her math. Not metaphorical math, but the actual logical scaffolding, step by step, the way her father had shown her how to trace a fault in a machine by working backwards from where it broke. And at the 17-minute mark, Hugo Llewellyn stopped looking at his phone. At 22 minutes, the Vancouver partner from the day before had stopped writing notes and was simply listening. At 26 minutes, someone in the second row raised her hand, thought better of it, and put it down, not because she disagreed, but because she wanted to wait until the end. At 28 minutes, Odessa said, "The standard we've been applying isn't wrong because we weren't paying attention. It's wrong because we trusted a ruling that was built on an unexamined assumption, and nobody went back to examine it. That's fixable. That's what this framework does." She closed her folio. Honorable Gordon Fedditz did not begin clapping. Judges don't lead applause. But the room began, from the second row outward, a wave of it, and within 4 seconds, it was the whole room. And she stood at the front and received it without deflecting it, because her father had told her once, when she had shrugged off a compliment, that deflecting good things is a habit, and habits can be wrong. Question period ran 35 minutes over time. Nobody left. At one point, a senior arbitrator from Montreal named Robert Sauvé, who had been practicing for 40 years and had, famously, never publicly agreed with anyone under 40, said, "I've been turning over the third assumption for the last 12 minutes, and I can't find the hole. Walk me through it again." She did. I said, "That holds." It was 3 words. It landed like something much larger. Bridget, from her seat in the 6th row, caught Odessa's eye and said nothing. Just a small nod, the kind that means I told you. Llewellyn waited until the room had mostly cleared. He came to the front. He had the bearing of a man who was used to being the most prepared person in any given conversation, which meant that this particular moment was costing him something real. He said, "The Harrington critique. You've been sitting on that for how long?" Odessa said, 18 months. He said, "Why a symposium? You could have published." He said, "I wanted to say it in a room where people could push back. Publishing is a monologue. This was a conversation." I looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "We're opening a dispute resolution practice in our Ottawa office. If you're interested in a conversation, I'd like to have one. Ed, send me the details." She did not say it eagerly. She said it. The way you say something when you know your value and you are open to the discussion. Nodded. He left. Began gathering her notes. A flight back to Halifax left at 6. She had 2 hours at Pearson, which she spent in a quiet corner near the gate, with a coffee and her phone, and a text exchange with her mother that devolved, as all text exchanges with her mother eventually did, into a debate about whether she was eating enough. Was not, probably, but she would be. I thought about the morning, not with pride exactly. Pride felt too loud for what she was feeling. It was more like settling, like a thing that had been held at a slight angle had finally come to rest level. He thought about Stanhope and his chair scraping back, and the way he had looked at her lanyard and read her name and not apologized. She thought about the way some rooms are built with the assumption that certain people will require proof before they can enter, and how the proof is never really about competence. It's about whether the room can survive being wrong about someone. She thought about Bridget, who had cited her paper in a brief and said it held up. And she thought about Robert Sauvé saying that holds. She thought about her father who fixed things that seemed unfixable, and her mother who pressed a blazer with a borrowed travel iron and believed it mattered. She thought about the 35 minutes of questions that nobody had walked out of. State agent called her row. Odessa Kamara picked up her bag, tucked her folio under her arm, and walked to the door. She did not look back at the terminal. She did not need to. Work was done. The room had changed. And she had said everything she came to say, not to prove anything to anyone, but because it was true, and because true things deserve to be spoken in rooms that would rather not hear them. That is its own kind of justice. Kind that doesn't need a verdict to be real. I keep thinking about that chair scraping back. Not the presentation. Not the applause. Not even Robert Sauvé saying that holds after 40 years of never agreeing with anyone under 40. I keep thinking about that chair and the way Clifford Stanhope looked at Odessa's lanyard like it was evidence of a clerical error. Because that moment, that small, ugly, ordinary moment, is the one that tells you everything about how the rest of the story had to go. What Stanhope did wasn't exceptional. That's the part that matters. It happens in boardrooms and faculty lounges and hiring panels, and all the places where someone has decided, in advance, who is allowed to take up space. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's a redirect glance. Sometimes it's a question asked with just enough skepticism to signal that the burden of proof is on you, not them. Most people on the receiving end of it spend enormous energy managing their reaction, staying composed, staying professional, not giving the room a reason to say, "See, I told you." Odessa didn't perform composure. She just had it, and I think that's the distinction worth sitting with. There's a version of this story where she walks in angry, where the injustice of that first moment costs her something in the room. It wouldn't have been wrong to be angry. The anger would have been earned. Odessa had spent years building something that couldn't be rattled by a chair scraping back, a kind of integrity that comes from knowing very precisely the quality of your own work. That's not arrogance. Arrogance is certainty without foundation. What Odessa had was something quieter. She had done the work and she knew it, and that knowledge didn't need the room's permission to be true. Her parents gave her that. Her father who fixed things that seemed unfixable. Her mother who pressed a blazer with a borrowed iron, because details matter and effort is its own form of respect. Now, don't grow up in that house without developing a particular relationship with rigor. With the idea that doing something well isn't a performance for an audience. It's a standard you hold yourself to whether anyone is watching or not. That's the moral center of it. The reason the work was honest. The reason it held up. And there's the intellectual piece. The 18 months she spent sitting with a problem that everyone else had accepted as settled. The Harrington case. Seated, upheld, trusted. She didn't dismiss it. She respected it enough to interrogate it. That's what real thinking looks like. Not tearing down what came before, but being willing to ask whether it still stands when you push on the right corner. That takes courage of a particular kind, the kind that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Just a person at a desk, reading, rereading, writing in margins, starting over. What I find myself returning to is what she said to Hugo Llewellyn. Publishing is a monologue. This was a conversation. She wanted to be challenged. She chose the harder room on purpose. Because she wasn't trying to be right in private, she was trying to advance something true in a space where it could be tested. That's what grit actually is, I think. Not refusing to feel the difficulty, not pretending the chair didn't scrape back. It's doing the next thing anyway, with the full weight of the difficulty acknowledged and set aside. Odessa felt every second of that boardroom. And then she uncapped her pen, and she waited, and she let the work speak in the only language a room like that actually understands. A chair scraped back. The room went silent. Both things happened. One of them mattered.